One of the advantages we have in working on these later model diesels is that the yoke and the field clamp are, this being the yoke on top, field clamp underneath, are separate. They're two pieces. In the earlier diesels, they're one and the same. And that made it a little more challenging because you could not center the field until you actually put the motor back into the chassis. You weren't given an opportunity to do it separately. With these, the yoke and the field clamp being separate, you can. Another advantage that these separate pieces have is it allows the truck to pivot on the, not the yoke assembly, the yoke assembly. Whereas in the older models, you didn't. They were rigid. And I think that was part of the issue when they started climbing or descending an elevated railroad, is that this stayed rigid, whereas instead of bending a little bit as it went up or moving a little bit. To get it off, I'm simply going to take a very sturdy but yet sharp pocket knife, just the way Mr. Barker does it, insert it between the field clamp and the yoke assembly, pry the yoke assembly up just a little bit so that the hole becomes free of the screw, and then we'll be able to drop the motor out. And with the excess wire we have on here, I think I'll be able to pull it down and then flip it up on its wheels, and it'll be a lot easier to work on at that point. As I anticipated, by not reinserting or reassembling the two-position reverse unit in its normal position, I was able to sit it up on this side of the body, and I put just the masking tape up here to hold it stable because it does have those singular strand wires that connect to the coils, and I think even a single strand piece of wire. They are very delicate, so I just put this up there to keep it from moving around and possibly falling off. It allowed me to, once the yoke assembly was separated from the field clamp, allow me to drop the motor out and then set it up on its wheels. And I just used just a regular pocket knife to insert between the field clamp and the yoke assembly to get the screw out and then drop it off. I'm going to make a mental note that it looks to be one lamitation exposed on the field to the left, and then 4 laminations to the right, maybe 3.5 at the top, 4 at the bottom, just to get a mental note as to where it was before. Doesn't mean it's perfectly centered, but I usually like to check what it was before I disassemble it. All I'm going to do offline is remove these 2 screws that hold the worm covers in place, and then the 4 screws that hold the bearing straps. Underneath there are the bearings. And of course this one, I'm going to leave 1 screw in place because on the far side, the brush bracket holder has just a clamp that fits into the screw, so it'll be more convenient just to leave it there. That should allow me to lift this whole thing out. Of course, we're going to have to undo this screw right here as well. Lift everything out. The field clamp, the armature, the brushes, the brush bracket or the brush holder, everything. You'll note that I anticipate replacing these pull mores with some grooved pull mores because these are very hard. They're very slick. They don't seem to have a lot of grip. Plus, I just happened to notice they've got some big chunks, relatively large chunks taken out of that rubber right here. That couldn't be good. So I'll be replacing it with the grooved pull mores. Okay, I've got the motor disassembled down to the point of just having wheels, axles, and its chassis. Remove the armature, the field, and the brush holder. I removed its screws, the field clamp, but I did not disturb the screws that are on top, which are used to center the field. I'm going to try using the centering that was done at the factory. Now, anytime I remove screws from a softer metal, like you find on these motor chassis, I always put the screws on a piece of paper and map them back to their original location. I find that works best for me because the screws are a harder metal than the metal that the chassis is made out of. So I want to match the location that it was in previously, so that the screw threads hopefully will match up perfectly again, and I won't have to have any risk of cutting new ones. So it only left this screw in right here, which doesn't need to come out because the clamp fits in. It has an opening on one side and you can just reattach it and then put this one back in. Now with the removing of the bearing straps and the brush holder, I was able to remove the armature. Nothing unusual there. It's got the usual darkening. That'll be all polished and ground a little bit. The shaft will be simply wiped down. It will not be polished. I don't see any reason to do that. And of course the worm gears will be cleaned thoroughly, as well as all of the motor chassis itself. Now one of the things I check very closely is are the thrust plates. So I'm going to free one hand so that I can possibly focus down on that. And there you can see the rear thrust plates, and you can see the large divots that's in that thrust plate. Now if you put the armature back in here, you'll notice that this is the plate that accepts the thrust in the rearward position when the train runs going backwards. Unusual that it would have the largest dimple in it of the front two. There you get a better shot of it. It's a candidate therefore to be replaced, and all I'm going to do is use a knife to pop this one out. I keep them in stock all the time, and I'm just going to put another fiber thrust plate in here. Now I might put one that's partially worn because I don't want the armature to fit really tight in there. The one that accepted the forward thrust is not as large, and I'm going to leave it in there because you're going to have, the train is going to require one of the two to have some divot in it so that the armature will fit back in, and then that you can still exercise the backwards and forwards thrust. Now up next will be thorough washing and spraying of this with a brake cleaner to get it thoroughly clean. I'm going to go ahead and do all that spraying first because one, I don't want to be handling it when I'm putting on the new pull mores, but I don't want to spray the new pull mores with the brake cleaner. That is a really powerful solvent, and I don't want to damage these the new ones in any way. Now I also examined the brushes, and I'm going to put the camera steady so take a look at those. They appear to be the original brushes. Let me see if I can bring that camera down a little bit and stay in focus. They appear to be the original brushes. This one in particular is worn pretty significantly, and you can see how it is been worn to the shape, the surface shape, contour of the commutator. I'm going to put new ones on there and square the ends off so that they will, in a new position, accept the commutator and start wearing down. Very easy to remove by simply releasing these solder points at the top, and you can slide them out and slide some new ones up into the holder. We're ready to begin some of the final steps in the rebuild of 234, the diesel GP-7. Before we go into final assembly, I am going to go ahead and lubricate this rear truck and attach it after the motor is put back together, because I don't want to work on it while the field is dangling. The first thing I'm going to do is put on these grooved pull-more wheels from Portline's Hobby. I've had very good results with these. We're not going to put on any vulcanized pull-mores. These are, I think, very useful, and I've had a lot of success with them on my own trains, in addition to their initial installation, but also in changing the pull-more. Because they're grooved, they can be pulled off, new bands can be purchased, and they can be put back on fresh. So I'm going to put those on, and other steps to do are the installation of some new brushes, the adjustment of the thrust plates, and of course that's the wheel pulling tool. And then we're going to work a little bit on the adjustment of the armature. The thrust plates, I want to get the wheels on first before we start working on the thrust plates. I think it's this one right here that has the large hole in it. and I'm going to put either a new one or partially worn one back here. I don't want the armature fitting in too tightly, but I do want to leave some room for thrust. But I don't want it to be so much thrust that the armature is moving out of alignment with the field. The other thing I'm going to demonstrate, probably the first thing I'll go ahead and demonstrate, is a slight or mild grinding of the commutator. To grind the commutator, this drum style commutator, I mount the armature inside of a variable speed drill very gently. I don't put a tight squeeze on it. There really isn't a need to. It's not going to be providing much, the armature is not going to be creating a lot of torque up against the sandpaper because it will be rubbing up against a sandpaper sponge. And all I do to grind these drum style commutators is to place the commutator very carefully on the sandpaper sponge, not to harm any other portions of the armature, and then begin it running at a very slow speed. As you can see, it doesn't need a whole lot of grinding. I do want to get a couple of marks out of it, and maybe it's a little bit of relief that's in it. You can see it took off a little bit of the copper, and that should be sufficient. The next step is to just wipe it down with an alcohol paper towel. So the armature has been ground down a little bit to provide some fresh surface to the commutator. I've had a lot of success and good results doing this using the sanding sponge, which minimizes the amount of pressure that's put on either a drum style commutator like this or disc style commutator, rather than grinding it on a wood block. Lots of success with this. You can see it's pretty smooth and pretty evenly shaped. One of the things I hope to accomplish in recentering the armature is to reposition the brush. It looks like, and I find this to be to happen quite a bit, it looks like the brushes have been over here on this side of the commutator a lot. I'm going to see if I can recenter it some to bring it back to the center of the commutator to start it wearing in a new place.